In the fall of 1902, a man named Thomas Crossley Johnson sat down in the Winchester Design Department in New Haven and began drafting patent specifications for a self-loading rifle. The rifle he was designing did not yet exist in commercial form. No factory in North America had ever sold one. The concept was new enough that the legal and engineering work required to protect it from future infringement had to be built from almost nothing, because there was almost nothing yet built that might be infringed upon. Johnson had been doing exactly this kind of work since 1885, when he arrived at Winchester as a 23-year-old draftsman, the year after graduating from Yale's Sheffield Scientific School. For his first decade and a half, he had spent most of his time in the position that every talented designer who works in the shadow of a legend eventually occupies, doing the invisible labor that turns someone else's rough toolroom prototype into a finished product, writing the patent specifications that protect someone else's idea from the competition, preparing the drawings that translate someone else's genius into something the production floor can actually build. The someone else was John Moses Browning. The invisible labor was everything that made Browning's designs into Winchester rifles. Johnson's name was not on any of them. Browning was gone by the fall of 1902. He had walked out of President Thomas Bennett's office the previous year after Bennett declined to discuss royalties on the new self-loading shotgun Browning had designed. A departure from the flat fee arrangement that had governed every previous Browning sale to Winchester. For 20 years, Browning had brought Winchester a rifle or shotgun design, taken the flat fee, handed over exclusive rights, and gone back to Ogden to design something else. Winchester had taken the designs, refined them for production with the help of men like William Mason and Johnson himself, and sold millions of them. The Model 1886, the 1892, the 1894, the 1895, the lever-action Model 1887, the pump-action Model 1897. The revenue from those designs had built the Winchester catalog and the Winchester reputation and the Winchester brand as thoroughly as Benjamin Tyler Henry's original repeating rifle had built the New Haven Arms Company 30 years before. When Browning left for Fabrique Nationale in Belgium, he did not just end a partnership. He left a vacancy that the American firearms industry had never faced before. Winchester needed a designer who could work in the full light under his own name, producing new Winchester designs that had never been Browning designs. The company turned to the man who had spent 16 years making Browning's designs buildable. It turned to Thomas Crossley Johnson. Johnson was not Browning, and no one at Winchester pretended he was. Browning was a self-taught genius from a gunsmith family in Utah who had been inventing firearms mechanisms since adolescence and who had a gift for conceptual design that his contemporaries recognized as something outside the normal range of engineering ability. He did not work from first principles because he had no need of them. He worked from intuition about what a mechanism needed to be, and the mechanism worked when he was done. Johnson was a trained engineer from a well-educated Connecticut family whose talent was different in kind, not smaller in scale. He had graduated from Yale's Sheffield Scientific School, which produced engineers who understood manufacturing processes with the depth that comes from formal training rather than intuition. What Johnson understood with unusual depth was the relationship between a mechanism and its production. He could look at a design and see where the tolerances would cause problems on the floor, where the machining sequence would create cost, where a small change in geometry could reduce hand fitting without reducing function. He had spent 16 years applying that understanding to Browning's prototypes, and in doing so, he had learned the inside of every mechanism Browning had ever built for Winchester, better than anyone else at the factory. When Winchester needed him to design from scratch, he brought that knowledge to the drafting table. The difference between him and Browning was not a difference between a major talent and a minor one. It was a difference between two kinds of intelligence that the firearms business needed in equal and different measure: the intuitive genius who conceives the mechanism, and the engineering mind who makes the mechanism producible at scale on a manufacturing floor. Winchester had relied on Browning for the first kind for 20 years. When Browning left, it discovered that the second kind had been building the factory's capability all along and was ready to work independently. The Model 1903 came out of that drafting table and went to market as the first commercially available self-loading rifle in North America. Winchester had a catalogue full of lever actions, which were the rifles that had made the company. A self-loading rifle was something new entirely, a rifle that cycled the action automatically on each shot using the energy of the fired cartridge, producing a rate of fire that no lever action could match. The Model 1903 was chambered in .22 caliber, fed from a 10-round tube magazine in the buttstock, and used a blowback action that Johnson had been refining since he filed the original patent in April of 1901. Winchester wrote a circular letter to every dealer and sales agent in its network that stated directly that if anyone suggested the Brownings were the whole thing and nothing was left, the .22 automatic gun was their answer. That sentence, preserved in Winchester's records, was the clearest acknowledgement the company ever made of exactly what was at stake and exactly who had been handed the task of answering it. By the early 1930s, Winchester had built 126,000 of the Model 1903. In 1933, the rifle was updated as the Model 63 to chamber the more common .22 long rifle cartridge, and approximately 175,000 more were sold before production finally ended in the late 1950s. A man who bought a first-generation Model 1903 in 1903 or 1904 was not a collector. He was a farmer or a ranch hand or a hardware store owner who had been reading about the new self-loading mechanism in magazines and wanted to know what it could do. He walked into the shop, weighed it in his hands, and felt something different from every lever action he had ever picked up. The lever action required a deliberate motion, a full stroke of the arm that took time and took the rifle off target and had to be completed before the next shot was possible. This rifle cycled with the energy of the fired cartridge, faster than any trained man could work a lever, without moving anything except the trigger. He paid for it and took it home. He shot it at his target off the back porch and discovered that it worked exactly as described, the action cycling without his hands, the 10-round tube magazine in the buttstock, meaning he was shooting for what felt like a full minute before he needed to reload. He wrote to his cousin about it. He told the man at the feed store. By the time he had put a few hundred rounds through it, the rifle had settled into the back of his wagon, the way a useful tool settles into a useful place, not as a novelty, but as an implement. That adoption, replicated across thousands of buyers in the first years of production, was what turned a patent filing into a revenue line, and a revenue line into proof that Winchester could produce something the American market would pay for without Browning's name on the design. The proof was economic before it was historical. It kept the doors open. The Model 1905 followed in 1905 and was the first commercially available centerfire self-loading rifle in the United States, chambered in .32 and .35 Winchester self-loading. Fed from box magazines of 5 or 10 rounds, a rifle that pointed directly at the emerging civilian market for high-capacity centerfires that the military adoption of the bolt-action magazine rifle was creating by demonstration. The Model 1907 came in 1907 in 351. Winchester self-loading. A cartridge powerful enough for the French and Russian governments to order quantities of the rifle for military issue during the First World War. The Model 1910 followed in 1910. Johnson had become chief designer in 1907, and the production floor in New Haven was running on his blueprints. You already know the position this man occupied and what it costs to occupy it. You have always known. The person who does the foundational work that a famous person's work requires does not accumulate the fame. The patent specifications that protected Browning's designs were written by Johnson. And when those designs made Winchester rich and made Winchester famous, the fame went where the designs went. Johnson had written the specifications. Browning had produced the designs. The attribution in history follows the second half of that sentence. When Browning left and the designs stopped coming, and Winchester needed someone to produce new designs under Winchester's own name, Johnson stepped forward. Winchester told its dealers the .22 automatic was their answer to anyone who thought the Brownings were the whole thing. They were right. But they were also saying, without quite saying it, that Johnson was the answer. His name was not in the circular letter. The rifle that carried the most weight in the years after Browning's departure was not a rifle at all. It was a shotgun. Johnson produced the Model 1912 pump-action shotgun, which reached the market in 1912 and was immediately named the perfect repeater by Winchester's sales department. The name was not marketing overreach. The Model 12 was built from forged steel throughout, with internal parts machined to precise specifications and hand-fitted on the production floor. Johnson had taken Browning's Model 1897 pump-action as his starting point and solved the problem that the 97 had never quite addressed. The exposed hammer that cycled backward along the receiver as the action was worked, creating a hazard for anyone whose thumb was in the wrong position when the slide moved. Johnson enclosed the hammer inside a streamlined receiver machined from a single billet of forged steel, making the receiver both safer and stronger than the 97. The bolt locked directly into the receiver rather than through a secondary mechanism, producing a lockup that the gunsmiths who handled both shotguns could feel as a kind of mechanical certainty the 97 lacked. The trigger pull on the Model 12 was better than any production pump shotgun that came after it, and remained so for decades. In 1912, over 100,000 of them had sold within 2 years. In 1914, the Model 12 sold 47,347 shotguns in a single year, while the old Model 97 sold 17,519. By 1915, over 100,000 total Model 12s were in the field. The US military adopted it as a trench gun in the First World War, fitting it with a heat shield over the barrel and a bayonet lug, and used it again in the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. Over 2 million were produced before Winchester discontinued it in 1964. A 52-year production run that overlapped with more American military conflicts than any other shotgun in the nation's history. It remains the shotgun by which every other American pump action is still measured. Johnson did not stop with the Model 12. The Model 52 bolt-action .22, which he developed in the late 1910s and which reached the market in 1920, became one of the most accurate rimfire rifles ever built. Small-bore competition shooters used it to set records for decades. The Model 54 hunting rifle, introduced in 1925, was the direct ancestor of the Model 70, which Winchester would market as the rifleman's rifle, and which became one of the most successful bolt-action sporting rifles in American history. Johnson produced the patent specifications for the safety mechanism that was used in the Model 21 double-barrel shotgun, introduced in 1930, which became Winchester's finest and most expensive production shotgun and was owned by Charlie Chaplin and Gary Cooper and Errol Flynn, which is as good a testament to a firearms elegance as any sales figure. Thomas Crossley Johnson died in June of 1934, aged 72. He had been at Winchester since November of 1885, 49 years at one company. 124 patents assigned to Winchester between his first day and his death. He had arrived as a draftsman, become the man who prepared Browning's patents for production, become chief designer in 1907, and spent the last 3 decades of his tenure guiding the company's design program through some of the most structurally difficult years Winchester ever faced, including the crisis of the Browning departure, the First World War expansion that nearly bankrupted the company, and the financial collapse into receivership in 1931. Every gun he designed that sold kept the doors open a little longer. The Model 12 alone, with 2 million units over 52 years, was as commercially consequential as almost any firearm in the Winchester catalogue, except the Model 94 itself. There is a Model 12 in a case in a gun room in a farmhouse outside Madison, Wisconsin right now. It was made in 1937. It has a 28-inch barrel, solid rib, and a stock with the checkering still sharp enough to bite. The action is smooth in the way that forged and fitted steel becomes smooth after 60 or 70,000 rounds, a smoothness that modern injection-molded actions cannot produce because the smoothness of forged steel is not an inherent property of the material, but a product of the repeated contact between precisely machined parts over years of use. The man who owns it shoots it on the sporting clays course twice a week in the season. He knows it was designed by Thomas Crossley Johnson. He knows because he looked it up. Most people who own Model 12s do not look it up. Most people who own Model 12s know the name Winchester the way the people who use them know the name Browning, which is to say completely and without qualification, because that is whose name is on the factory, and on the history, and on the reputation that Johnson's rifles helped build and sustain for 5 decades after Browning left. The chain runs from that Madison gun room back to a New Haven drafting table in the fall of 1902, where a man who had spent 16 years doing invisible work began producing designs under his own name. It runs from those designs to a Winchester circular letter that told the company's dealers the .22 automatic was their answer to the claim that the Brownings were the whole thing. It runs from that letter to the Model 1903 and 1905 and the Model 12 and the Model 52 and the Model 54 and 124 patents that together constitute a body of work as large as any firearms designer in American history who is not John Moses Browning. The chain runs before Johnson too, back to the 1885 day when a 23-year-old Yale engineer arrived on Winchester Avenue and sat down at a drafting table in the design department and began learning the mechanisms that William Mason was preparing for. Production, and the mechanisms that Browning was sending down from Ogden with rough drawings and the expectation that someone else would finish them. That someone else was Johnson for 16 years. The floor he built his own designs on was built from the designs he had finished for Browning, and the vocabulary he used to design the Model 12 and the Model 52 and the Model 54 was the vocabulary he had learned from those 16 years of getting someone else's genius ready for manufacture. The shadow Browning cast was not Johnson's fault and not Winchester's intention. It was the natural consequence of one man's genius being larger than any other name in the building. The shadow is real. What it covers is also real, and it is still there. The patent files say 124 inventions from November 1885 to June 1934. The official Winchester record says the Model 12 is a Winchester shotgun, one of 2 million produced. The design record says Thomas Crossley Johnson filed the patent, drew the plans, solved the exposed hammer problem, and delivered to the production floor a shotgun the US military would carry into 4 wars. The history says Browning. Every museum label says Browning. The factory that made Johnson's rifles closed 20 years ago, and his name is on none of the facades. Only one of those sentences tells you who kept the company going when the famous name finally left.